Hi, and welcome back to the Viridian Tea House. Thank you again for all of those who watched my first video. Like I said, I admit I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm just learning along the way. Anyway, my doors are open to you. Please come and be refreshed. So today, I have brewed some Harlem Muse, which is one of my white teas. It is a Baimudan mixed with jasmine and lemon balm. And the taste, so I've already steeped. A very hint of mint through the lemon balm and also some of the floral through the jasmine. And then just white tea has a very delicious taste to it. Like it's really kind of hard to put it into words. That is good. So white tea is the least processed, and I consider it to be the most delicate of all the different kinds of teas. Now, keep in mind that your black teas and your pu'ers and your oolongs and your greens and your yellows and your white all come from Camellia sinensis, one tea plant. The difference is the processing, the oxidizing, the non-oxidizing, the fermentation. With regards to white tea, it is the least processed, like I said, so you're getting the most delicate aspect of tea. That's just my opinion. Don't quote me on it. The reason why I made Harlem Muse was for one of my favorite authors of all time. Her name was Nella Larsen. If you're not familiar with her, I highly recommend looking up her books. She only wrote 2, Passing and Quicksand, plus a bunch of short stories. There was a 3rd book, but I reached out to her biographer and he claimed that there was no copy of the 3rd book. She was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and while everybody else thinks of Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes, Nella Larsen was quite a figure in terms of writing of the Harlem Renaissance. Recently, the United States Postal Service did create a stamp in her name, and I was so excited to see that. And it looks like more and more people have been reading her work. So, like I said, if you ever get a chance to read Nella Larsen's books, Quicksand or Passing, I highly recommend them. And like I said, this particular tea is one of my white teas, and it's called Harlem Muse. Okay, enough of the shameless plug. I hope you have a cup of tea or coffee, I'll allow it this time, or even water or hot chocolate, because now I would like to read to you. This is one of my books called The Decembrists. This was published through Dark Oak Press in Memphis, Tennessee. And years later, after I wrote it and read it a million times, I realized it's kind of sort of like Jane Eyre, but not really. Anyway, so the blurb on the back says, Sophie Joyce, a young writer, soon becomes a part of best-selling author Hilliard Ravensdale elitist world. Yet what she desperately wants comes at a terrible price. Shocker. Revealing a secret from Hilliard's past that will threaten to destroy them both. So I figured I would read part of the first chapter or just see how long I can go. Like I said, get your tea or your favorite beverage ready. Let's begin. Sophie, January. When I met Hilliard, my grandfather was in the ground. After a long life filled with jazz music, extreme tastes, and never saying no to anything, my grandfather died peacefully in his sleep. A little side note, my grandfather's death did partially inspire me writing this book, so yeah, that's the reason why I started it the way that I did. My mother was the first one to find him. Grandma was still asleep and everything hit the roof. My mother was staying with her parents for one night while taking care of her father. Granddad came down with a severe cold, giving Grandma enough reason to ask their daughter to come by and visit. I came by as a support staff, doing as much as I could without getting in the way, then left a couple hours later. When my mother found him the next day, she immediately called my father and me to come to the house. I was not shocked, but rather sad. I had promised to take him to a local jazz festival for the 5th time in a row. He was looking forward to seeing Donald Harrison perform. Side note, I really do enjoy Donald Harrison. The whole family prepared for his funeral within the next 2 days, making sure he was taken care of without delay. The funeral was quick and to the point, with many in attendance to say goodbye. He was well loved by all and never had an unkind word to say about anyone. He was a rare human. So, on a cold Thursday in January, I buried my grandfather with frozen tears on my cheeks. When I saw the dirt placed over his casket in the ground, I closed my eyes. After the repast at my parents' home, with much food and many friends coming to talk to the family, I went home and cried for a full hour. Funny thing was that I cried only because it was so cold in my apartment and not because of my dead grandfather. Even though I missed him, I knew he was in a better place, be it the Christian heaven, nirvana, or return to earth already as a bird, lion, camel, or even as another human being. My grandfather had an old soul, one that had been used before. I knew I would see him again very soon. Since I was off the next 2 days for bereavement, I decided to drive to one of the funky local coffee shops to take in a cold and sunny day while sipping a cup of hot tea. Shocker. Although I had 20 different kinds of tea at home, I wanted to be out among people that were not affected by my granddad's death. I wanted to remind myself that the world did not end just because he died. Perhaps it was shallow of me to think like that, but for me it was necessary. I drove to Indigo Bean and ran inside because it was freezing cold. I ordered a pot of Japanese sencha while looking at some artwork by a local artist, and then found a quiet corner table and sat down. I looked out of the window as I pulled out my latest read from my messenger bag, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Side note, I did read Anna Karenina and I loved that book, and that was another inspiration for writing The Decembrists. I was in the middle of the massive tome and I couldn't wait to dive back into 19th century Russia. I prepared my cup, opened up the book to my bookmark, and began to read. Soon, Tolstoy's words caught me like a flame, and I knew several hours would be lost today. What I did not realize was that while I read and absent-mindedly drank tea, a man watched me with great interest. After 20 minutes of reading, I finally looked up, saw his face, and smiled. He grinned as he got it from his table and sat down across from me. "I know this sounds so cliche, but I could not help noticing what you were reading," he said in a deep and thoughtful tone. "You don't find too many people reading Anna Karenina these days, then. Tell me, for school or pleasure?" "Simple pleasure," I replied. "I'll read anything I can get my hands on as long as it has a good story." I placed my bookmark in the book and fanned through it a couple of times. I read Crime and Punishment not too long ago and wanted to return to Russia. "I read Crime and Punishment when I was vacationing in Paris a year ago," he said as his eyes stared into my own. Was he searching for something, I wondered, or was he just trying to size me up? To this day, I still don't know, but what I did know is this. I was attracted to him. He took my book and caressed the cover, cheap trade paperback, then placed it back on the table and extended his hand out to me. "Hilliard Ravensdale," he said as I shook his hand with firm grip. "Sophie Joyce." We shook hands for several seconds in silence, our eyes never leaving the other's, and then I released mine and smiled. I knew this man. I had read his novels, and here he was, sitting across from me in a small coffee shop in Memphis. "I know who you are," I said. "I've loved every one of your novels." He smiled and for a moment almost sighed like a schoolgirl with a crush on her professor. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Joyce. It's Miss, and please call me Sophie." "Only if you called me Hilliard, then." I glanced down at his hand and noticed no ring. Maybe he had a girlfriend, or maybe he was gay. However, I wanted to talk to the author and not shack up with him. Dismissing the typical girly thoughts from my mind and replacing them with literary ones, I said, "So, are you working on anything new?" "Actually, yes, I am. In fact, I'm here trying to gather research for possible characters. I'm just people watching, drinking vanilla lattes and taking notes then." "Seen anyone interesting so far?" His eyes glanced over my whole face, and I tried like hell not to blush, but did so anyway. "I've never seen a black woman blush before," he murmured. "I love it. Suits you, actually." I smiled as the blush remained. Was that the wrong thing to say? Should I have been more PC or something then? He waved his hands around for emphasis, causing me to laugh. "Actually, to be honest," I continued, "I don't like the PC crap. To me, it sugarcoats what people are really trying to say. I want the real meaning behind words, not just something to please the intelligent black woman who reads a lot. My last statement caused his eyebrows to go up in surprise, or acceptance, or perhaps both. Well said, I think. And yes, you are beautiful when you blush, but you're beautiful even when you don't. I've never said that to a black woman before, and honestly, I'm glad I said it. He smiled as he looked down at his hands. I looked at them as well. They were long and slender, and some of his fingers were stained with ink. They were the hands that typed and wrote for a living, I thought. I wanted my hands to look like his one day. I was currently working on my first novel and still wet behind the ears. Here was a man who not only wrote for a living and supported himself with his words, but he also lived the life I so desperately wanted, the life of an eccentric and creative soul. I wanted to reach out and touch his hands to feel the fingertips that graced the keyboard and produced such literary mammoths. Without thinking further on the matter, I did just that. For a second, his eyes remained focused on his hand, then they moved to my hand, and then he looked up at my face and smiled. Do you mind if I bring my stuff over here? I think your table is bigger than mine. I nodded yes, and he got up to retrieve his bag, journal, and latte. When he sat down again, he said, "Why did you touch me like that?" "Because I wanted to know what your hands felt like," I replied, not caring if he thought my answer was dumb. I wanted to know what an author's hands felt like. "And how do you feel now that you've touched my hands then?" It makes me want to finish my novel even faster. "Ah, so you're a writer too, huh?" I figured as much. He took a sip from his cup, then set it by his hand. "And what are you writing?" "A novel about a woman who reads Anna Karenina, and suddenly her world begins to change and become that of what she reads." He nodded as he took another sip of his drink. "Anyone wanted to look at it yet?" "I do have one friend who's a publisher. He wants it once I'm done." "What company?" Corvus Correct Publishing. Side note, I do enjoy anything involving crows or ravens, so I had to create a publishing company named Corvus Correct. Anyway. "Ah, yes, Andrew and the gang, huh? Good people and a good choice. They're good in my book since they want to publish my first novel." "How far along are you?" "I'm actually done, but I'm editing it final time before I give it to him." He sighed, finished off his cup, and set it far away from himself. "Do you mind if I read it before you give it to him?" I was stunned. Hilliard Ravensdale, one of the biggest well-known authors in this country, wanted to read my work? The man who I placed next to British author Ian McEwan, god of literature. Side note, I actually do worship Ian McEwan, so if he ever sees this video, I adore your work. Really, Atonement was fantastic. And based all of my literary hopes on, wanted to read my work. For a brief second, I only stared at him in mute shock. I felt that my words would betray me and make me out to be a gushing admirer. However, he wanted to read my work. He made the suggestion, not I. I quickly reeled in the emotions and returned to being a writer. As much as that makes me feel really good right now, I would like to finish my edits and then give it to my hopefully soon-to-be publisher. No offense. None taken, Sophie. However, what about dinner tonight? Fuel Cafe, perhaps? I looked at him, wondering if perhaps I offended him in refusing to let him read the work. Then again, he invited me to dinner, so... Fuel Cafe sounds lovely. What time would you like to meet? How about if I pick you up at your place, say around 6 p.m., then? I blushed again, harder this time, as I now stared at my hands. Suddenly, I saw his hand touch my own. He gave it a brief squeeze and said, "All I want to do is get to know you." I looked up, saw his green eyes actually deepen in color, and told him my address. So I'm going to read a little bit more in just a minute, but I figured I would take a tea break. So, Okay, back to the reading. I paced around my living room in a nervous fit. In 20 minutes, Hilliard Ravensdale would be at my place, and I still had no idea what to wear. Fuel Cafe was a really hip and cool restaurant in the Midtown area of Memphis. Side note, I actually did live in the Midtown area of Memphis, and Fuel Cafe used to be one of my favorite places, but unfortunately, I think it shut down. I don't know if it moved or anything. Anyway. The last time I went, I wore yoga pants and an oversized shirt. Although I wanted to dress for comfort, I still wanted to impress Hilliard. After all, he had connections that I could possibly use in fueling my own literary career. I paced around once more while occasionally glancing out of my windows at Midtown Memphis in all of its glory at night. The headlights played momentary spots of false hope along the street as people drove to their destinations, not aware of how it all played out so deliciously well together. I love putting delicious in my stories, delicious. I moved to Midtown 10 years ago because I wanted to be around the bohemians, the artists, the people who refused to conform to safety and reason. I wanted to be alive and experience every sensation possible while understanding just why I did what I did. I wanted to learn more about Memphis and what she, as a city, could offer me. So far, she offered me quite a bit and still had more to give, as long as I was still willing to take it. When I returned home from university in Boston, Massachusetts, I hated Memphis, claiming that it was awful and it would drain the life out of me. It did, but only because I allowed it to happen. When I finally realized that my life would change only with me taking that first step, I took that step and never looked back. Now I had a good shot at being published while learning about my life and why I was repressed and held back simply because I was afraid. Now I had a chance to be alive. When those thoughts entered my head again as I paced, I stopped and walked into my bedroom to pick out something to wear. I did not care what Hilliard thought of my clothing. I just wanted to enjoy a good night and a good meal with a man that did what I wanted to do. Just as I put on my earrings, the phone rang. It was Hilliard. I picked up my phone, no longer nervous. "Hello there. How are you?" he said in that same deep and thoughtful voice. "Doing good. Would you like to come up or shall I meet you downstairs?" "If you don't mind, I'd like to come up then." "Well, when you come in, use the second set of elevators." "Right. See you soon, Sophie." I hung up the phone and turned on my CD player. Although my grandfather was in the ground, I still felt the need to play jazz. I wasn't ready to leave the music just yet, even though I knew I could come back to it at any time. Jazz would forever mean my grandfather in my mind. As Herbie Hancock performed One Finger Snap, I heard a knock at the door. I walked over and opened it, revealing Hilliard dressed in a black sweater, jeans, a dark gray wool coat, and black loafers. His salt and pepper hair fell all over his head, and for a moment I wanted to ask him if there was a strong wind outside. He held a bunch of roses as he walked in. "Ah, good old Hancock then," he said as he walked into the living room with me following. "Good taste. Like jazz a lot then?" "Yeah, my granddad was a jazz lover in our family. He taught me everything I know about jazz." "Was he a musician?" "No, just loved the music and collected many records. I'm supposed to be getting them this week. Several hundred, I think." "I know you'll have quite the collection," he said as he handed the roses to me. I took a long and satisfying sniff of the lovely bouquet. I wasn't sure if you'd like roses, but I figured it couldn't hurt. "You're the first person to actually buy roses for me." He smiled sadly. "Glad I was then." He took the roses from me, placed them behind his back, pulled me closer to him, and kissed me tenderly. For several seconds, I did not know where I was or who I was. All I knew were his slightly cold lips, and I was glad for them. I could smell a soft scent of lime mixed with sandalwood on his clothing and skin. I opened my eyes and melted into that scent, wanting more, but knowing I could only have so much tonight. When Hilliard pulled away, he said, "Do you have a vase?" I walked into the kitchen to find one, leaving him in the living room. "You know, I've never been in Kimbrough Towers before yet." "I've driven by here 1,000,000 times," he said. Yeah, I've wanted to live here for quite some time, but never thought I made enough. Turns out I did. I found one of my vases and filled it halfway with water, then carried it out into the living room. Hilliard took the vase from me and placed the roses inside while I turned off the music. I then led him out of my place with only one thought. I was in love with him. And that's all I'm going to read of the Decembrists. If you want to know more what happens to Sophie and Hilliard, you can order this wonderful, delicious book either through Amazon or if you go to my Etsy store, that's Viridian Tea Company, Viridian Tea Company. You can order a copy of the book. And also, too, seeing as how I do own a tea company, 'Tis saying of the Ravensdale was influenced by the Decembrists. So if you want to get the whole books and tea package, order both or not, or one. I just hope that you enjoy this little reading of the Decembrists and joining me in a cup, now second cup, of Harlem Muse tea. So that's it for another moment of the Viridian Tea Room, or Tea House. Yeah, tea room. It's tea. Anyway, to Nella Larsen, to all the dreamers and the writers and the artists out there, I raise my cup to you. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Shalom.